All right, today we're diving into something that honestly sounds like it was ripped straight from a sci-fi novel. It's a new phase of matter, something scientists thought was completely impossible until very, very recently. Get ready, because we're about to try and wrap our heads around something called a time crystal.
Okay, so before we get into the time part, let's just talk about a regular old crystal. You know, like a snowflake, a diamond. We all know what they look like, right? Well, they all have one thing in common, one really important property. And that property, it's all about a repeating pattern in space. The atoms inside are locked into this perfect ordered grid that just goes on and on. Think of it like a wallpaper pattern, but with atoms. The crucial thing here is that it's static, it's fixed, it doesn't move or change over time. It just sits there.
Okay, so you've got that picture of a pattern in space, right? Now, what if you could have a pattern that repeats in time? Imagine something that just ticks back and forth, oscillating between different states forever. That, right there, is the absolutely wild idea behind a time crystal.
I mean, it's an incredible idea, right? But for a long, long time, scientists thought it was completely impossible. Not just difficult, but literally forbidden. Like the fundamental laws of thermodynamics, the basic rules of our universe said, nope, can't happen, not allowed.
And here's why. The roadblock was something called thermal equilibrium. It's a fancy term, but the idea is simple. It's just the natural, lowest energy resting state for anything. Think about a cup of coffee you leave on your desk. It cools down to room temperature and then just sits there. It's stable. It's unchanging. That's equilibrium. And in that state of perfect rest, you just can't have something that's moving in an ordered pattern forever. It would basically be a perpetual motion machine. And physics is pretty clear that those don't exist. So this is the key. You've got equilibrium, that lazy resting state, but then there's non-equilibrium. That's where you're actively messing with the system. You're coking it, prodding it, feeding it energy. So instead of letting that coffee just cool down, imagine you're constantly stirring it. Now it's active, it's dynamic, and it turns out that is the loophole. This is the secret backdoor where the impossible suddenly starts to look possible.
And this is where the big breakthrough happens. Researchers basically said, okay, fine. We can't make a time crystal in its natural resting state. So what if we don't let it rest? They came up with a recipe, a way to actually force one into existence. It's a special kind, called a discrete time crystal. And its whole deal is that it can only exist when it's being pushed around, out of equilibrium.
So, what's in this recipe? It's got 3 key ingredients. First up, you need a drive. This is basically a constant rhythmic push from a laser. It's what keeps the system energized and stops it from getting lazy and falling into equilibrium. Second, you need interactions. This just means the little particles have to be able to influence each other, to kind of talk to each other. And then there's the third ingredient, and this is the one that's going to sound really weird. Disorder. Yep, you need to add a bit of randomness to the mix. It sounds crazy, but it turns out to be absolutely essential.
Okay, so if the last slide was the cookbook, this is a snapshot from the kitchen. This diagram here shows you exactly how they do it. It's a sequence of laser pulses. See that U1? That's the drive. Ingredient number 1. Then U2 comes in and flips a switch that lets the particles interact. That's ingredient 2. And finally, U3 zaps it with a bit of disorder. And they just repeat that whole sequence, drive, interact, disorder, over and over and over.
All right, so they've got the recipe, they're running the experiment. What actually happened? Well, they did this with a tiny little chain of just 10 ions, all lined up in a row. You can think of each ion like a tiny little magnet that can point either up or down. And what they saw when they ran this recipe, it was, honestly, spectacular.
First, let's look at what happens if you leave out one of the key ingredients. So here they've got the drive, they've got the disorder, but, and this is key, the interactions are turned off. The laser pushes the ions and they start wiggling, but because they can't coordinate with each other, they just fall out of sync almost immediately. It's just a jumbled, chaotic mess.
But now, watch this. They flip the switch, they turn the interactions on, and bam, it's like magic. Suddenly, all those ions just lock into step. They start oscillating together in this beautiful synchronized rhythm that's perfectly stable and just keeps repeating. That right there, that collective dance, that's the time crystal forming. So, okay, it looks cool, but how do they know for sure it's a real-time crystal? Well, it has this one very specific telltale signature. It's called a subharmonic response. And the drum analogy is perfect here. Imagine you're tapping a drum once per second. Tap, tap, tap. But the drum only makes a sound once every 2 seconds. Boom, boom. It's hearing a rhythm, but it decides to respond with its own new rhythm that's exactly twice as long.
That's what the time crystal does. It breaks the time symmetry of the drive.
Now let's go back to that super weird ingredient, disorder. It's so counterintuitive, right? You'd think adding a bunch of randomness would just destroy this delicate little crystal, but it does the exact opposite. Check out these two plots. On the left, with no disorder, you can see the signal dies out pretty fast. The system just heats up and the crystal basically melts. But look at the right. When they add that disorder, the crystal is way more stable. The randomness acts like speed bumps for energy. It stops the system from absorbing too much energy from the laser and overheat.
And this might be the most exciting part of all. The crystal is rigid. What does that mean? Well, think of a really good clock. Even if you bump the table it's on, it keeps ticking perfectly. That's rigidity. And that's what this graph is showing. Down at the bottom, they're intentionally messing with the laser drive, making it a little imperfect. But look at the signal from the crystal. That sharp peak stays strong. The time crystal just shrugs off the errors and keeps its own perfect rhythm. It's incredibly robust. And for quantum systems, that is a huge, huge deal.
Okay, so let's zoom out. They've made this bizarre, impossible thing in a lab. It's obviously really cool science, but so what? Why should we care? What's the big picture here?
Well, for starters, it proves that there's this whole new world of matter that we've barely even looked at, stuff that only exists when you're actively pushing it around. But more practically, remember that rigidity, that incredible stability? That is like the holy grail for things like quantum computing. See, quantum information is ridiculously fragile. A stray vibration can wipe it out. But a time crystal's natural toughness could make it the perfect material for an ultra-stable quantum memory, like a quantum hard drive that protects its data all by itself.
And that really leaves us with this one big mind-bending question. For pretty much all of history, physics has focused on stuff that's in its natural, comfortable, resting state. But now we know there's this whole other universe of possibilities when we start actively pushing systems out of that comfort zone. It just makes you wonder, what else is out there? What other impossible things are just waiting for us to figure out the right recipe to bring them to life?